What's up? Welcome to another episode of Back Bone Zone. Thanks for joining me on this Monday morning. I just spent the weekend up in the Central Coast actually coaching one of my young students, I guess you would call him. And it was a good time going up there. It's interesting, BMX in this day and age is something where you can coach someone, and as much as people would probably think that's, there's some people out there that would think maybe coaching is a little bit not needed in BMX. It's pretty cool to be able to help out a rider to see them, achieve what they want to do, and whether it's just for fun or not. It's really cool to see. And there's been a lot of kids that have just stuck into BMX more, because I've said this a few times with coaching. A lot of people now with the internet, a lot of young kids, they'll jump onto a bike because they've seen someone on YouTube do it, and they are like, man, I've only been riding for I've been riding for 1 month and I can't do this. And it's like a really cool way as a coach to come in and say, look, BMX is really, really hard, but that's partly why it's so fun, is because it takes an entire lifetime to not even learn. You can't really master BMX. I've never seen anyone master BMX, although there's been a few that you could certainly mention. Mike Aitken comes to mind. But, there's a real opportunity for people in this new modern age, with the age of the internet and with people needing gratification so fast. Young riders, they jump onto a BMX, they've been riding for a month, they think they're no good, and then you're able to say, no, like, you've only been doing this for a month. Like, I'm going to show you some stuff that's then going to get you to be a foundational rider, have solid fundamentals, and then that way you can have fun for longer. So I think it's been really eye-opening with coaching for me to do that. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about bike setups. It's something that I'm always discussing with my friends, different bike setups and whatnot. And I guess if you're just listening to this, I'll be showing a few video cues and just pictures along the way. So, feel free to jump onto the YouTube channel and check it out. But I am interested on bike setups because if you think about back in the day, in the 80s, a lot of riders ran very small top tubes. I don't know if people know this. Younger riders may not know this, but the top tube length was shorter and the rear end length was much longer, but their bar height seemed to be similar in height to what we run today in 2022. So it's interesting in that way, because what you found in the 80s is that the handlebars were kicked forward quite a bit. Now, this is what I want to get into, because I think that the way that you set your bike up plays a huge role in the way that you ride. And this whole thing with, say, bar setup and bike setup comes to my mind because of one picture that I had to find. And it's on Instagram. If you don't follow, there's an Instagram account called Real BMX. So it's real_b.m.x. And they just post, what their interpretation of Real BMX is. And this photo that they've posted has stuck in my mind since I saw it. And I think I'd seen it once before somewhere, but, for it to show up in my feed, I literally think about it all the time, but I'd never saved it or anything like that. And it was quite funny to go onto the internet today and search for it, because it turns out it was from... they posted it in 2017, which is 5 years ago. So it goes to show how much this one photo has resonated in my mind. So if you're watching it now, or if you're just listening, I'll show you. This is the photo here. So It's of a rider, Mike Dominguez, who I think rode for Haro and potentially Hutch back in the day. And for those that are just listening, it's basically in an old school skate park that almost just resembles a drain, and then they've DIY concreted a quarter pipe out of the top of this drain. So the drain looks to be about maybe 6 foot, and then the quarter pipe that they've built on top of it is probably another 6 foot, and it's got about 2 feet of vert. And this dude is like, man, he's got to be like 8 feet out of this thing, just absolutely blasting. It's huge. I definitely recommend you go and check it out. The post on Real BMX is from 9th of June 2017. And anyway, Mike Dominguez obviously blasts, but I'll bring up another photo here, which is just on Pinterest that I found. This is when he was riding for Hutch. But what you can see is the alignment of his bars with his forks while he's doing this look back. The bars are quite far forward, so he's running a short bike, but he's got his bars forward. And what I want to explore is the ramifications that having your bars knocked forward will do for your actual riding. Now, again, short bike, so you would think, oh, maybe he just needed to run his bars forward to give himself more room. But I theorize that by having your bars forward like that, it puts your weight more forward over your front wheel, of course, which then allows you to stand more aggressively. And then it also allows you to tip your bike forward into the transition so that you can land smoother. I've always said this, and I'll go back to that photo of Mike airing that DIY quarter. I feel like I have never seen people air as good as what they did in the 1980s. Now, people definitely air really, really well today, but I feel like that bar position has got a lot to do with being able to have a shorter wheelbase, but then have a more aggressive stance and have, a more wide open bike. The way that people used to air back then is so mind-blowing. Like, people, I'm sure if you haven't seen on say someone like Dennis McCoy's Instagram, he's always posting footage from the late 80s, early 90s, and the airs just look so effortless, but they're going like 10 foot out, whereas 10 foot is no joke, especially on a quarter pipe the quarter pipes that they were riding. So yeah, the bar forward thing is a bit of a crazy idea. I think back then we look at those bikes from the 80s and we're like, well, that, again, they're small, so of course they needed to have more room. But then we start to push forward in time a little bit, and we get to, say, the late 90s, and maybe bars were getting a little bit smaller. Of course, S&M brought out the Homes, so that had a 21-inch top tube. Bikes are getting bigger, and I think the triangles of the bikes, we go back, the triangles of the bikes were starting to get going from being equal size like they were in the 80s to then the front triangle was a lot bigger than the rear triangle. And then, we push forward to something that you'll see here, which is actually from a magazine that I had back in the day. It's a Corey Anastasio bike check from, I think it would be like 1998 or maybe early 1999. And this is it here. So you can see, if you're just listening, his bars now are kicked back into his lap. So if you were to talk about bar angle in line with the forks, his bars now are actually behind the angle of his forks. So even though he's running a bike that is theoretically longer in the top tube, he's actually now got less room in that cockpit area. So the cockpit would be, the area between the seat and your grips. As well as that, the bars have gotten smaller at this point in time in the late 90s, very early 2000s. It was not uncommon to have, say, 7-inch rise bars or 7.25-inch rise bars. And if you were to watch Nastasio back then, he was obviously killing it, as well as a lot of other riders. Someone like Ryan Nyquist had bars that were called Haro Slim bars, or there was the knee savers. But anyway, much smaller bars, but the way that they would ride was still amazing, but it was more, I guess, what you would call suited to dirt jumping. But my theory is that potentially dictated the type of terrain that they were riding, or the type of terrain dictated the way that they would set their bikes up. So if you think about trails or jumps back in the day, landings were mellower, everything was a little bit lower in height, and there wasn't any deep necessity to dive into a steep landing compared to the jumps that you have today, where if you were to look at East Side, the jumps are absolutely massive. So and really, really steep. So I'll just bring it up. Yeah, like if you were to look at landings now at Eastside, we're talking super steep, almost like we're looking at like a quarter pipe. And now as jumps progress, we're starting to jump away from or move away from those kicked back bar style. So it's interesting to me because the idea now, if we look at the way that Nastasio's bike was in the 90s with that kickback bar, and then if we were to compare it to pretty much his latest bike that I could find, and this is it here. So he's now riding for Fit, and I think he's definitely got a signature bike, that Fit Metal Eagle, which is pretty cool. But his cockpit, his top tube length, probably fairly similar to when he was riding for Huffy, maybe a little bit longer. But now he's got taller bars, and his bars are much more further forward. And if you contrast the way, if anyone can remember the way Nastasio rode in the 90s and early 2000s compared to the way that he rides today, even though he's older, he's actually much more active on his bike. And my theory is that it's because he's got a more aggressive stance over his front wheel. So for those that maybe haven't thought about this, when you're riding BMX, everything tends to happen through the front wheel. And this would be a good way to get back into or a part of how I coach. We definitely use our legs to pump and drive through the quarter pipe or drive off the lip, and also to pump to maintain speed. You're definitely using your legs, but the more active you are through your shoulders, upper back, and using your arms, basically the top half of your body to drive through whatever it is that you're riding, you've got more ability to maneuver your bike around. And then when you couple that with coming into steep landings, the ability to be a little bit more over the front while still being safe, it feels a lot safer. If you were to have, say, if Nastasio was to have his bars back in his lap, but then was to push his bike so that his bars pushed forward while he was diving into a landing, he would literally be like vertical with his front wheel facing the ground and his back wheel dead up into the air before his bars got to 90. Whereas with his current setup, with the bars forward like that, he's able to use his bike to push forward, and he's got like still a safe position with his wheels, but he can be a bit more aggressive with his bars. Also, the thing that it does is it allows you to do the opposite, and when you're pulling back off the lip, you can pull back harder without looping out. So if you had your bars back in the lap and you pulled back, because your bars are so much closer to the back axle, which is one of the pivot points on your bike, you're more likely to go up in the air and sort of feel a bit more loop out or stallion or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, it's interesting to think about the way that bike setup and not just top tube length and rear end length can determine the way that your bike feels. I have certainly not necessarily fallen victim to, but I have had bars just a little bit back of the forks back in the day because I grew up, idolizing dirt jumpers, and obviously Nastasio was one of my biggest influences back in the day, and everyone ran their bars either in line with their forks or slightly kicked back, it seems like, back in the lap. And now, my current bike, I certainly don't have it as far forward as Nastasio, but if you can sort of see, I've got my bars are quite far forward of the forks, and that is still with me riding a pretty big bike. So this is where that really cool individual style and individual preference of BMX comes into play. I think that the tall bar and the forward bar isn't just a street riding thing. If you're riding transition or you're riding jumps, having your bars slightly forward, I think can help with so much of being able to pinpoint your bike going into the landing, and gives you essentially more room without changing the wheelbase of your bike. So on my current bike, I have a pretty long back end. For those that don't know, for modern day, I have a 14 it's about 14.4 is where I sit my wheel. But individually, I've got really long reach, so I've got really long arms, and I think that plays into why I want a long back end. It's just something, to think about when you're choosing your next bike, and just fun to think about that you can kick your bars forward and just see, maybe that does feel a little bit better. Of course, we're all creatures of habit, I guess. We would, if you've done 1,000 reps with your handlebars one way, 1,000 jumps, 1,000 runs at the skate park with your handlebars in a particular position on your bike, and then you're moving forward, it's obviously going to take a little bit to get used to it. And sometimes we can think that we enjoy something better just because we're more used to the way that it was. But I would be interested to know what the correlation is between moving your bars forward and airing higher, or being able to come into landings better. Because looking back at that photo of Mike Dominguez from 1980 something, and all of the riders that came around that era, and even vert riders, up until fairly recently, and even Jamie Bestwick, if you were to look at him now, he's a little bit from the old school in terms of vert riding, but he's obviously still just kills it today. But his bars are much further forward than some of the other vert riders of today. So if you're wondering, maybe you can't air quite high enough and maybe you want to give it a shot, then certainly could suggest maybe just knocking those bars forward just a touch. I know it made a huge difference to my riding when I started putting them forward, and now my bars sit probably just on vertical, I'd say, to the ground, so perpendicular to the ground, maybe a tiny bit back, but it's not all top tube length and rear end length that can determine the way that your bike feels and the way that you're riding. Certainly your bars play a huge part. But just something I wanted to talk about. I'm, as always, really, really interested to hear your thoughts. Again, we can learn so much from the riders of the past. I think that we need to celebrate our legends more in BMX, and I wish that it was easier to find that old school footage. Obviously people didn't have phones back in the day. They weren't filming on the gram constantly, but the photos that you see from the 1980s still hold up in terms of the blastability and even the tricks that they're doing. Like, I don't know anyone that can just do 10-foot high 540s or whatever like some of these guys used to do, especially on ramps that are only like 8 foot wide and whatnot. So don't forget the past. You can learn so much from it, and I think the modern age, our bikes are better than they've ever been, and the geometry I think is super spot on. Well, at least I love my frame. But just taking a little bit of knowledge from the guys that were just figuring it out. And again, Real BMX, the Instagram page, kind of put it perfectly. I read one where he said that style before they even knew to try. And that's such a perfect way of looking at it. If you were to think that all these guys were just trying to figure it out, so they're not even really worried about what their bike looks like. They're just worried about trying to go high. They're trying to think about how to tweak tricks, and their style flowed naturally out of them. So, I think that's a perfect example of Corey Anastasio today. When you first look at his bike, you think, wow, that's like not what I would expect from Anastasio, but then you watch him ride, and I think in his mid-40s, however old he is now, I think maybe 44 or something, he's riding better and he's more active on his bike than he ever has been, which to me, if you're maneuvering your bike around like that, then you are riding better than you ever have. So anyway, give the bars a try or not. Be interested to know what you think. Always love, discussing BMX stuff like this. So if you've got any ideas on what to talk about in terms of bike setup, I'm all ears. But anyway, do me a favor, like the video, subscribe to the podcast, give us a review, be back next week, and have a good one.